around how we can take climate action during COVID. So how are you dealing with COVID right now?
I'm literally so sick of this quarantine, but the more people try to break the rules, the longer they're gonna have to drag this out.
As best as anybody else, it's kind of hard, trying to force routine.
It's odd, but somehow this pandemic has brought us together.
How do you feel about the response the government has taken so far?
I feel like our government is so short-sighted again and again and again. And we're seeing that right now with coronavirus, when there was every opportunity to have our pandemic response team. We knew months in advance of this deadly, deadly crisis that this was going to happen and wreak havoc on the world. And we did nothing. We didn't listen to any of the experts on coronavirus. And that same exact pattern is what we've seen with climate change.
Do you think that there's going to be more pandemics like this?
Yeah, 100%.
Pandemics often happen, when there's unnatural interaction between humans and animals. We have to fix our factory farming and animal agriculture industry.
We're going to see more species that are going to be moving into new areas. We're going to see different bacteria different viruses, bacteria, all sorts of stuff that are in the Arctic, frozen right now, starting to melt and come out. And we don't know what implication that's going to have on human health.
I feel like there's two types of paths that we can go down right now. One is filled with more pandemics, more wildfires, more hurricanes, more environmental disasters. And then there's another one where there's renewable energy, sustainable and regenerative agriculture, and a ton of new jobs for people. Why is right now a pivotal time for us to invest in climate action?
Right now during COVID, the economy is broken. So this is the chance to rewire and move forward. And we're gonna have to rebuild, period.
We also have the ability during this crisis to put a down payment on a regenerative economy.
I know that Black folks have the highest death rates for the coronavirus, and they also have the highest rates of asthma. And that's due to environmental racism. I think that this is a time we have to recognize whether or not we go back to supposed normal.
Remember what normal was? Remember in January when Australia was on fire? That was normal before the virus, and that was a crisis.
So we need to make sure that we're actively making decisions that are thinking more forward.
What are some action items that I can take right now to combat climate change from home?
At home, it doesn't mean we can't organize, right? There is always the ability to build community, to organize. And there's all sorts of ways that we can actually come together right now. For example, right now, I see you on this Zoom call, hey.
Yeah, we're organizing right now.
We can't do any physical mobilizations around the climate crisis right now, but what we can do is do a lot of online.
Political TikTok's an interesting realm where a lot of kids just make content educating kids on things like healthcare or gun control or capitalism, and it's been pretty successful. I know a lot of kids who've gotten radicalized or have learned a lot more.
Cool. Thank you so much for talking to us. Bye.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for what I believe you're going to find to be a very stimulating and important discussion on the existential threat to our planet. And I'm not just talking about the pandemic or the economic meltdown that we're experiencing now. I'm talking about climate change. And before I go any further, I want to thank the young people who put together that video you just saw, and that's Saad Amer, who is the founder of Plus One Vote, Jamie Margolin, who is the co-executive director of 0 Hour, and Isra Hersey, who is the co-founder and co-executive director of the U.S. Youth Climate Strike. So guys, thank you so much for the video, and thank you and millions of other young people for helping to lead the struggle to save our planet. Tonight, we're going to have a wonderful discussion with 4 incredibly knowledgeable folks who have had a profound impact in terms of what is going on in our country and, in fact, the world in terms of climate change. We're going to lead with David Wallace Wells, who is the author of The Uninhabitable Earth, a book that I read recently. And if you want to know what's going on our planet, It's a very good read. And David is also a climate columnist for New York Magazine. Then we're going to go to somebody who I have known for about 20 years, who is a good friend of mine who lives down the road, about 35 miles down the road in Ripton, Vermont, a prolific writer, the author of many books, including Falter, which is also a very good read, and one of the co-founders of 350.org, and that's Bill McKibben, of course. Then we're going to go to Varshini Prakosh, who is the co-founder and executive director of the Sunrise Movement, one of the great young youth movements in this country, doing a fantastic job rallying the American people to stand up to the fossil fuel industry and save our planet. And last but certainly not least is somebody I have known for also a very long time, and that is the governor of the great state of Washington, Jay Inslee. Jay and I served together in the House. Jay, as you know, ran for president, and in his campaign, he said boldly that he thought that climate change was the issue. It was the issue he focused on. He did a great job doing that, and he is doing a great job as governor. We're going to talk to him about, given the absence of leadership, to say the least, in Washington, what our governors around the country are doing. Right now, we are all immersed and struggling with an unprecedented crisis in our country and around the world. I don't have to tell anybody that in America now, over 80,000 people have died. Millions of people have been infected with the coronavirus. Some of us in Congress are working hard on a new piece of legislation that addresses the fact that we need far more testing before we can safely open up this country, and that we need to protect the tens of millions of workers who have lost their jobs, who don't have health care today because they lost their jobs, who are worried about being evicted from their apartments or losing their homes, worried about not being able to pay their student debt or their credit card debt, and on it goes. But in the midst of this terrible moment, we cannot lose sight of what I think everybody on this panel believes, and I certainly believe, is an existential threat to the entire planet. And I use that word existential very advisedly. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the reality of what is going on today. We're going to talk about what happens if we don't bring about very aggressive and fundamental change in terms of our energy system and the need to combat the fossil fuel industry. We'll be talking about some of the great work that people are doing in many organizations, Sunrise being one of them. And we'll talk about what governors and other elected officials are trying to do. So there's a lot to talk about. We welcome your questions. So if you have some questions now, or you'll think of some questions during the discussion, please send it to us. So let me begin our discussion with David Wallace Wells. And as I said, David is the author of The Uninhabitable Earth, and he's a climate columnist for New York Magazine. David, in your book, the largest section has a number of chapters, and let me just read the chapters to you. You know them better than I, because you wrote the book, and that's called Elements of Chaos. Heat, death, what happens when the planet heats. Hunger, drowning, what happens when we have more and more flooding. Wildfire, what happens when we have more and more fires. Disasters no longer natural. Freshwater drain, what happens when we lack drinking water. Dying oceans, an issue we don't talk about very much. Unbreathable air. So if we can get the camera on David rather than Jay, that would be good. And David, take it away.
Well, first, I want to thank you so much for having me on this panel. I'm thrilled to be talking to you, Senator, but also actually thrilled to be talking to each of the other panelists, each of whom I stand in awe of. I mean, they're really, it's an amazing group. Where we are right now with climate is already quite grim. I think the list of those chapters suggests that pretty clearly. The planet's only about 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer than it was since before the Industrial Revolution. And that doesn't sound like very much, but it actually means that we are already outside the range of temperatures that enclosed the entire history of human civilization, which means that everything we have ever known as a species is the result of climate conditions we've already left behind at just 1.1 degrees. It's like we've landed on a totally different planet with a totally different climate, and we have to figure out what of the civilization we've brought with us here can survive these new conditions, what we will have to adapt and renovate, and what we'll have to just totally discard. There are a lot of things that we've seen just over the last few years that illustrate just how different the world is now than it was a few decades ago or centuries ago. They're the wildfires, they're the unprecedented heat waves, the flooding throughout the Midwest that's crippled the ability of American farmers to grow their food. But actually, one of the examples that I find most powerful is one that may not strike everyone as the most dramatic, and that is that in Houston last summer, they had what they called a 500-year storm. It was the fifth 500-year storm in 5 years. So that term has lost some of its meaning, obviously, in the time of climate change, but I think it helps to remember it used to refer to a storm we'd expect to hit once every 5 centuries. 5 centuries ago, Hernando Cortez had just landed in Mexico. There were no European settlements in North America at all. So we're talking about a storm that we would expect to hit once during the entire history of colonization, the waging of a genocide against the native people, the fighting of a revolution, the building of a slave empire, the fighting of a civil war, industrialization, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, the American Empire, the end of the Cold War, the end of history, September 11th, and the financial crisis. We're talking about a storm that was supposed to hit once during that entire history. And Houston has been hit by 5 of them in the last 5 years. And that's just at 1.1 degrees of Celsius of warming. I think it's going to be quite hard for us to avoid 2 degrees of warming. And at that level, things start to
You're
get
talking about
really...
Celsius.
Yes.
For the non-scientists among us, translate Celsius into Fahrenheit.
It's like a 3.5, 2 degrees Celsius is like 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit of warming, which again doesn't sound like all that much, but since it is an average, it actually signals an enormous amount of heat that we're adding to the planet system. And at that level, 2 degrees, scientists believe that 150 million people would die from the effects of air pollution alone. That's dying at the scale of 25 Holocausts. They expect that cities in South Asia and the Middle East and parts of Africa would be so hot during summer that you wouldn't be able to walk around outside without risking heat stroke or possibly heat death. So these are cities like Calcutta that today are home to 10 or 12, some 15 million people. And in just a few decades, since 2 degrees is likely to happen at about 2050, 2040, you wouldn't be able to walk around in those cities during summer without risking death. That's one reason why the UN believes we could have hundreds of millions of climate refugees at just that point, 2050 at about 2 degrees. And we're also likely to be locking in the permanent loss of all the planet's ice sheets, which would take many centuries to melt, but over time would bring about 250 feet of sea level rise, which is enough to drown all of the world, or sorry, 2/3 of the world's major cities if we didn't move them, which we probably would. And when I say all that, it's an incredibly bleak future. I think practically speaking, it's actually something like our best case future, actually. We will be able to adapt to those conditions and find ways to live in that world. Ideally, we'll find ways to live equitably and with justice in mind in designing those adaptations. But it's also up to us to make sure that we don't heat the planet much more than 2 degrees. And that is the job that sits on all of our desks as, all 330 million Americans, but also all 8 billion people on the planet, all 190 countries in the world. This is a global problem with many billions of authors, but it is a story that we are writing ourselves. And just how bleak it gets, just how dark the world looks in 2075 or 2100 is very much up to us alive today and working. It's up to us to write that story. And that is, I think, for me, the most important fact about climate change is that it is happening really quickly, and we don't have much time to change course. When it occurred to me, when I realized that half of all of the emissions that we've ever put into the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels have come in just the last 30 years, which means we've done more damage in my lifetime than we did in all the millennia of human history that came before. I found that incredibly eye-opening, horrifying, and in a certain way actually exhilarating, because it shows us that we are in control of this story. We are making decisions today that will shape the future of not just our children or our grandchildren's lives, but the entire future history of the planet. And that we now have scientists say about 30 years to really take meaningful action to avoid those worst case scenarios means, in a strange way, it's incredibly lucky that all of us are alive today, especially you, Senator, and especially all the others on this panel, doing the work that they are doing to make sure that our future is at least relatively just, relatively prosperous, relatively comfortable, and relatively humane. That is not for sure. We've, in a lot of places in the US and Western Europe, we've sort of assumed that history unfolded like a timeline of progress, and all we had to do was sit back and let it happen. That is not the case generally, but it's certainly not the case with climate change. We must take control of this if we want a future that you and I, everyone on this panel, and everyone watching at home would recognize as appealing in any way.
All right, David, let me interrupt you. Thank you so much for all the work you've done for that excellent presentation. Bill, you want to pick up where David left off? And Bill is the writer of many, many great books. His last one is Falter, also dealing with the crisis of climate change, the co-founder of 350.org. Bill, where do we go from here? And what have we learned, by the way, from the pandemic we're experiencing right now? Bill, can't hear you.
Thank you, Bernie. Those are the right questions. And let me just say, I apologize for the odd position that I'm in at the moment. One of the smaller crises that continue to affect rural America is the lack of broadband internet, despite your good efforts. And so many of us, when we need Wi-Fi, end up in parking lots stealing it. The only good news is I get to see the Green Mountains out the window here and be reminded of the beautiful world that we're all working to try and protect. What a pleasure to get to be with the other people on this panel. David is doing not only great climate coverage, but great coverage of the pandemic. Varshini, we had the great news today, is joining these unity panel with Vice President Biden's team in order to work out the climate package going forward. And I have no doubt that they're going to be leaning heavily on the work that Governor Inslee and his team have been doing to bring that issue and all the solutions forward. Let me say just a couple of things about the moment that we're in and how there's a crisis inside a crisis. So the thing we're living through now, this great upset around the pandemic, it doesn't have any silver linings. There's too much pain and death and suffering. But if we're going to go through all that, we might as well learn a few lessons. And it strikes me that we are. 3, really. 1, and it sounds trite, but physical reality actually matters. I've spent 30 years trying to convince people that physics and chemistry matter, that they can't be forced to compromise, or you can't, negotiate with them. They just do what they do. The COVID microbe is teaching us the same thing about biology. It doesn't matter if the president gets up at his lectern and calls it a hoax or says it's going to disappear. It pays no attention. If it says stand 6 feet apart, you got to stand 6 feet apart, period, end of story. So that notion that physical reality matters is an important one to get in our heads, because we've spent the last few decades living in a world of screens and things where everything seems under our control, but it's not. Second lesson, corollary of that, and one that David alluded to, speed matters. It matters enormously. Look, we've gotten at this idea now about flattening the virus curve in our minds, and that's important. The US and South Korea had their first cases of coronavirus on the same day. South Korea went to work to flatten the curve. It's not perfect. They're still having outbreaks, but compared to what we did, which was delay, do nothing, think it was going to go away, cases would go to 0, there'd be a miracle, blah, blah, blah. Now we're in a situation where not only do we have to disrupt our civilization in ways we've never disrupted it before, but even having done that, we get tens of thousands of dead bodies. That's what happens when you delay. It's a pretty perfect analog for the climate crisis. Had we started to flatten the carbon curve 30 years ago, when some of us first went to work on this question, we would have been able to do it with relatively minor disruption. But we didn't, thanks mostly to the work of the fossil fuel industry, which spent 30 years in a kind of disinformation campaign. We didn't do a damn thing. As David said, we just kept spewing more carbon into the atmosphere. And that means now we're at a point where we have to do fairly big things, the kinds of things that Governor Inslee and that Varshini have been talking about with the Green New Deal. They'll be disruptive, but in a useful way, but they have to happen fast. And even if we do them, as David points out, we get big disruption. That leads to the third thing, the most important lesson perhaps, which is that social solidarity in the end really matters. You know, I've lived most of my life in the political shadow of Ronald Reagan, who tried to teach us that markets solved all problems and that our only job was to look out for ourselves. You remember, Bernie, that his great laugh line always was, the 9 scariest words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Ha, ha, ha. It turns out the scariest words in the English language are, we've run out of ventilators, or the hillside behind your house just caught on fire. And you can't solve those problems. Markets don't do a thing about them. You can't solve them by yourselves. You can only deal with them if you come together. And that's what we need to do. That's what the solutions that we're talking about envision. And in order to get those kind of solutions, in order to get that government action, we have to build the kind of movements that we've been building. And that's the good news. The last 10 years, 15 years, you know, we started things like 350.org, and now is a first iteration, and now there's been this powerful blossoming. So we see Extinction Rebellion, we see the Sunrise Movement and the enormous work they're doing. We see the great example of the youth climate strikers, some of whom we heard from at the beginning, all over the world. We're seeing great things happening. Now we have to bring that home. That's why we're working hard on around the politics of this year, on making sure not only that the presidential race comes out the right way, but we need a climate Congress. And at 350, we're working hard on that, which is an important part of it. And we're also working hard to hold the financial system to account. A lot of work in the last year or two on the big asset managers and insurance companies and banks, and we're getting someplace with that. If you want one historical note that kind of should make us feel at least like we're getting somewhere, for those of us who study the history of this thing, the guy who was the CEO of Exxon in the years when it learned about climate science and then denied climate science, a man named Lee Raymond, last week was demoted from his job, as his retirement job, as lead independent director of Chase Bank, the biggest fossil fuel lender in the world. And that happened because people across all these movements stood up and demanded it. It feels like we're beginning to understand where we have to go. Now we have to go there fast, and I mean fast. Bernie, you've been standing up for renewable energy for decades. Now's the time, since it's become the cheapest source of power in the world, to bring that home. You've been standing up for an ethic of consumption, of reduced consumption and of conservation and efficiency. Now's the time to bring that home. We've got to do it now because we don't have any more decades to waste.
All right, Bill, thanks so much, not only for being with us, but for your lifetime of leadership on this issue. Our next panelist is Varshini Prakash, who is co-founder and executive director of the Sunrise Movement. And certainly one of the exhilarating aspects of what's been going on politically in this country in recent years has been the fact that millions of young people are standing up, fighting for racial justice, for social justice, for economic justice, and environmental justice. And one of the great groups as part of that movement is, in fact, the Sunrise Movement. So Virginie, thank you so much for being with us. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Senator. I feel very blessed to be here and to be here with a lot of my political heroes and otherwise heroes. Hello, everybody. My name is Varshini, as the Senator said, and I'm the Executive Director for Sunrise Movement. We've been around since June of 2017, so it's been a fast and furious last 3 years. And we're building a movement of young people to stop climate change, to build economic prosperity and enact racial equality in this nation through a Green New Deal. And I really view Sunrise as essentially a political vehicle for young people to voice the frustration, the fear, the anger, and hope that our generation feels and transform that into tangible power. And we have hundreds of local chapters across the country that are led by teenagers and 20-somethings. We were proud to endorse Senator Sanders earlier this year and now plan to carry on the vision and the agenda that we all believe in by electing brilliant down-ballot candidates like Charles Booker in Kentucky and Jamal Bowman in New York. If you haven't heard about them, please check them out. And also by building a movement of thousands of young people that can make solutions to the climate crisis at the scale of the crisis move from politically impossible to becoming politically inevitable. And so I want to talk for a second about my experience growing up in this country as a millennial. One of my earliest memories was of 9/11 and then the subsequent violence of two wasteful and terrifying wars and the rise of xenophobia against brown people in this country. I remember seeing people tell my mother, go back to where you came from. And I remember growing up as the climate generation, watching Hurricane Sandy and Katrina ravage communities and kill people, watching Black people, poor people, those who were elderly and without health care suffer heavily. And just as I was graduating high school or in the midst of high school, we were hit with this tremendous recession and our entire future was thrown into confusion. Would we have jobs when we graduated? What would our futures look like? And I remember thinking at that time, wow, we have known about climate change for twice or 3 times as long as I've been alive on this planet, and yet we have failed to do something about it. And now I'm watching Gen Z grow up behind me. And I'll tell you, it breaks my heart watching them ask the same questions that I and others did. Watching Hurricanes Harvey and Irma and Maria, watching wildfires tear down houses and basically decimate entire towns to the ground. And they're wondering whether their lives will be defined by yet another unnecessary war in the Middle East. They're entering a period of economic unknown, of recession and possible depression. They're facing social isolation. Large numbers of people in our membership in Sunrise have lost their jobs completely, who have been cut out from or can't afford school at this time. And so I'm seeing just within 1 decade, this toxic cycle repeat itself. We have a broken economy. We have a broken system that values people based off skin color or the amount of money they have or how old or young they are or where they live. And I'm watching history repeat itself in live time. I'll say the thing that gives me hope right now is to also see in the eyes of like 14 and 15-year-olds, the understanding that our system is broken in fundamental ways and that the existing political establishment has failed them in fundamental ways. And if the system is broken in fundamental ways, then the only way to fix it is through a holistic and systemic restructuring of the systems that exist in our society. And so I'm seeing them kind of understanding this moment right around Corona, watching how creating food deserts in poor communities so people have to eat unhealthy foods and suffer from heart disease is making them more vulnerable to COVID. The fact that the most polluting industries are usually located in Black, Indigenous, or Latinx neighborhoods. So you have people suffering from asthma or cancer, contracting complications with COVID or dying from it. You're seeing young people being put in overwhelming numbers in precarious jobs with limited benefits and protections. So they're the first to be unemployed in moments of recession. So I don't buy all that talk about how now isn't the moment to talk about climate, right? These issues cannot be drawn apart. And I really believe we cannot solve them unless we view the solutions collectively. And I think young people are really ready to do that. I think young people are not backing away from this moment. Yes, we're a little confused because now we cannot gather in large numbers, which is usually what a social movement does. So it threw us for a loop there for a little while. But I think regardless, young people will lead the way along with our allies in the labor movement and environmental justice folks and political allies. Because I think right now, I want to share with you just this brief Naomi Klein quote that's really been helping me, that, during moments of cataclysmic change, the previously unthinkable suddenly becomes reality. In recent decades, that change has mainly been for the worst, but this has not always been the case, and it need not continue to be in the future. That means ideas that we imagined to be impossible suddenly become possible. All that stuff that pundits said about the Green New Deal, it's unrealistic, it's radical, it's crazy, it's never going to happen. All of that, I believe, could become possible in this moment because there is a rupture emerging. This crisis has put the injustice and the inadequacies of our society basically on full display. And people are pissed and they are ready for change. So we're seeing millions of workers going on strike to demand better working conditions. Since April, support for the Green New Deal has surged by 15%. Almost half of Republican voters want a green jobs guarantee. And climate change is one of the top issues for young people of both political parties. So leaning in on climate, that is one of the surefire ways to defeat Donald Trump in November. We cannot forget that. So we have to turn the tables on Trump and McConnell and all those guys and articulate a recovery that is in line with the principles of the Green New Deal and make that a reality. Because
I'm going to get back to you in a minute, and we're going to talk about the Green New Deal.
Okay, let's do it.
And let me just mention, when you were talking about everything always seems impossible, I always quote Nelson Mandela. You know what he said? He said, "It always seems impossible until it happens," which is essentially what you're saying. And that's a beautiful and profound quote. Let's go now to the governor of the state of Washington, somebody who has been a leader in this country in the struggle for legislation and efforts to protect our planet. And is also, by the way, doing a great job in his state dealing with the pandemic. Jay Inslee, thanks very much for being with us.
Bernie, it's an honor to be with you. Thanks for getting this great group together. Thanks for your decades of leadership. You've been an over-the-horizon thinker on this and so many issues, and you've moved the needle so far for decades, including your presidential run. So thanks for this honor. This is great to be with this panel. I'm batting cleanup, so I'll just add 4 thoughts. Thought number 1. Donald Trump cannot stop us states and we governors. He could not stop me from adopting a 100% clean energy bill in our electrical grid. He could not stop us in Washington from adopting the best energy efficiency programs in the nation. He could not stop us from adopting zero energy vehicle mandates. And I note this because with all of his dysfunction that he has been able to stop progress in DC, we have 50 alternative places to make progress. And we're doing that in so many different places. And we ought to seize that as opportunities in these states. And that's why I encourage everybody on this call today, not only to be involved in the presidential race coming up, but these governors' races and these state legislative races, these are opportunities to move the needle big time. So we didn't get Bernie or maybe even me elected president, but we can get our friends elected to the state legislature and pass these bills. Look, I was like maybe 1 or 2 votes short last year. I've got to pick up a couple state Senate seats this year to get my clean fuel standard through. So these are great opportunities in the states. The second thing is I want to quote David. He didn't talk about this tonight, but he said something. I was at a little forum, I think it was New Hampshire during the presidential race. He was talking and somebody asked him, how do you get up and get through the day realizing how dire this situation is, David? I mean, you understand the science with such depth to understand how deep this challenge is. And he says, no, you got to understand it. My book, my message is a positive message. Because what he said was, this is under our control. We control our destiny in climate change. This is not a story about a comet heading to Earth that we can't do anything about. And I think it's a really important message for we in the climate change movement to make sure that we are empowering people to act and making sure they understand that our destiny is in our hands. We got to make sure people realize we can really do good things here. And David, that was so inspiring to me when I heard that. I've told that story 100 times, so I hope you don't get mad that I'm plagiarizing you, and I do give you credit most of the time. So thanks for your inspirational message. The third thing is, this has always been an economic opportunity, but it is such a no-brainer at this moment with the COVID crisis that has precipitated this enormous economic challenge. And we should not miss an opportunity to drive home what Varsity was talking about, that this has enormous backing in our constituents to understand the economic necessity of this. And we should not be intimidated when people say, oh, you can't use this COVID crisis, to peddle a solution to climate change. No, we have to recognize the necessity of this moment, that this will allow us to rebuild our economy and jumpstart it. It was a necessity before the COVID crisis. It is an absolute requirement now to rebuild our economy. And we shouldn't be intimidated by Republicans about this at all. And the last thing I'll say is, we can't use COVID as an excuse for inaction on climate change. These are two things we have to deal with, and we can deal with both because they're so similar. They both are similar that they're based on an understanding of science. They're both similar to understanding that this is under our control. They're both similar that they're both fatal, threats to our communities. So I'm just have a feeling of being positive today. Seeing a panel that has such great ideas and a great future. And Bernie, thanks for having me.
Well, thank you very much, Jay, for being with us and for all the great work you're doing. Let me pick up on Jay's last point. What I want to throw out now is our opponents, sometimes in a malicious way, sometimes I think through ignorance, will say, hey, look, of course we all want a clean planet. Of course, we all want to make sure that our kids and grandchildren live in a habitable world. But you know what? You guys are dreamers, you utopians. Fossil fuel is with us, and you're talking about moving away from oil and coal and gas. It can't be done. It's impossible. All right, maybe David and Bill started off that discussion. What is the potential of energy efficiency and of sustainable energies? What could the world look like if we invested heavily in transforming our energy system, in retrofitting our buildings, and in taking on the fossil fuel industry?
Well, the first thing I would say is that it's actually not that expensive. The IMF, which is no left-wing environmental organization, says that globally we're subsidizing the fossil fuel business to the tune of $5.3 trillion a year. Now, a lot of that isn't direct subsidy. It's the fact that our carbon price doesn't reflect the environmental damage that burning carbon does. But many researchers have looked at that figure and said that for just a fraction of that investment, we could jumpstart an incredibly rapid green energy revolution, which would probably pay for itself within a decade. And as you all know, for public investment, that is an incredibly rapid turnaround. The benefits are not just distributed globally, though, and I think this has been one big problem with tackling climate generally. One has been that for a long time, economists did say that it was too expensive to tackle, and the people in politics who listened to them. But another was that we understood intuitively that the benefits of decarbonization were distributed globally, and the costs were going to be concentrated locally. And that meant that many particular leaders had a hard time persuading their constituents to go on board with something that might be a little hard on them. First of all, the economic conventional wisdom on that has really flipped quite recently. But secondly, I would say an incredibly promising vector of messaging that has been really underutilized with climate change until quite recently has been the public health case. And those benefits, the public health benefits, are concentrated locally. If you close down a coal plant, the people in those communities, the communities that Varshini was talking about, the Black and Brown and Indigenous communities, those people will benefit enormously. The costs, the benefits are so large that almost any amount of decarbonization will have a positive impact. And the costs of not doing anything are distributed all through our mental lives, our physical lives. Air pollution causes rates of cancer to go up, coronary disease, pulmonary disease. It causes rates of ADHD and autism and schizophrenia to go up. It raises the rates of premature birth and low birth weight. All of these things can be addressed through the reduction of particulate matter in our skies. It's actually not that hard to sell people on because they see it. Some of the polling that a number of the panelists have referred to, I think, is really clear on this. Even more than the fight for climate change, the fight for clean air and a clean environment is incredibly popular across the political spectrum and all the way through all of the demographic divides that we think are so.
All right, let me stop you there and go to Bill. Bill, tell us, what does a green economy look like? What kind of investments? Why is investing in solar good economics, investing in wind, investing in energy efficiency, investing in a transformed transportation system? Why does this make sense today?
Right. Let's talk about that word you used a minute ago, realism, because it's really the place to jump off here. Look, I'm sitting in an electric vehicle that was powered off the sunlight falling on my shingles in Vermont today. We couldn't have done that 10 years ago, really, but the engineers have done an unbelievable job. The price of a solar panel, the price of a wind turbines dropped 90% in the last decade. There was the biggest solar array in the world announced last week in the Middle East. The price for electricity coming out of that solar array is going to be about 1.3 cents a kilowatt hour. Every single constituent of every politician in America would love to be paying anything like 1.3 cents a kilowatt hour for their power. That means that there's no longer a technological or economic obstacle to rapid rollout of renewable technology. The obstacle remains what it's been all along, the powerful vested interest of what was the most richest industry in the world, the fossil fuel industry. They're falling on hard times. I mean, investors don't want much to do with them anymore, but they still have political clout. They used it this week to get a $750 billion bailout of their industry. And so that's what people have to be able to stand up to. If we can, then we start building out a renewable energy system that looks really different in a lot of ways from what we have. One, it's clean, so that's good, and you get all the benefits that David was talking about. And there's lots of people, I said before, there's no silver lining to a pandemic, and that's true, but there are a lot of people around the world who got their first lungfuls of clean air sometime in the last couple of months, and they'll remember what it was like to be able to see a blue sky, Second thing is, as we build this out, we're going to need a lot of jobs now because there are 30 million unemployed people in America all of a sudden. Well, if you cast around for what work needs to be done in our society that takes a lot of hands, there's no other candidate but this transition to a new energy system. Nobody's going to send their house to China to get it insulated. Solar panels don't erect themselves on your roof. That takes people doing that work, and that honest work that we need lots of people to be about. And at the end of it, you end up with a very different kind of world. At the moment, one of the reasons that political power and wealth are so unequally distributed in our society is that there are a tiny number of people who sit atop the concentrated deposits of coal and gas and oil. That's why people pay attention to the king of Saudi Arabia. It's not because he has some great idea about things. He cuts people's heads off when he doesn't like them. That's why people pay attention to the Koch brothers. It's not because they have some, wisdom about anything. It's because they're our biggest oil and gas barons, and they use their money to buy a political party. There'll be people who make money off sun and wind, but they won't make Koch brothers kind of money because when the sun comes up in the morning, it delivers your power for free. That's why Exxon hates it so much.
Bill, let me just jump in and ask you this question, and other people can pick up on it. For decades, the American people were lied to about the incredibly harmful impact that fossil fuel was causing our entire planet. And we have learned, I think you did, or some of you made the discovery that the engineers at ExxonMobil were telling that company decades ago what, in fact, carbon emissions were doing to the planet. And ExxonMobil, among others, continued to lie. And then we had a media out there that kept talking for a long time. Okay, you think your climate change is real, and you think it is not. Let's talk about it. And I remember talking to the head of CBS on this very issue, maybe listen to the scientists, not right-wing wackos. All right, but talk a little bit, Bill, and other people pick up on that. What role did the fossil fuel industry play in deliberately obfuscating the climate change crisis and the cause of that crisis?
Well, this is actually a good story for me to tell while I'm sitting here in the dark looking like I'm telling ghost stories around a campfire, flashlight under my chin, okay? Because it's the scariest story really almost ever. We now know from great investigative reporting that 30 years ago, companies like Exxon knew everything there was to know about climate change. In fact, somebody dug up this past year a chart that their scientists had produced in the 1980s that predicted with uncanny accuracy what the temperature and the CO2 concentration would be in 2020. By the way, this April was the hottest April in the history of the recorded history of the planet. There's about a 75% chance that we're living through what will turn out to be the hottest year the world's ever recorded. So they knew that that was coming. Instead of telling the rest of us, the industry spent they went and hired the guys from the tobacco industry, and they erected this architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation that kept us locked for 3 decades in a totally phony debate about whether or not global warming was real, a debate that both sides knew the answer to at the beginning. It's just that one of them was willing to lie. And that lie turns out to be the most consequential lie in human history. It cost us 3 decades when we could have been at work. And so now we're in this position of having to move with such speed. That's the point that David was trying to make. And that's why what Varshini and Governor Inslee and others now are doing is so important, because they're talking now about change at the scale that's now required. As I said before, had they told the truth back then, had Exxon said, the day that Jim Hansen testified before Congress in 1989, had Exxon said, our scientists are finding the same thing. It's not like they would have said, oh, Exxon, you're a bunch of climate alarmists. Everyone would have known that we had to go to work. We didn't go to work then. That's why we're under the gun now. And that's why it's so important that things like the Green New Deal have the level of ambition that they have. There's no option at this point but to think big.
On that note, Bill, let me go to Varshini. Talk about the Green New Deal. What is it? What impact would it have on American society? And by the way, let's get back to the reality that we all know, everybody knows, this is not an American issue. This is a global issue. And in fact, the United States could do everything right, but if the entire world does not come on board, the planet is in trouble. All right, Varshini, tell us about the Green New Deal.
One thing on that last point that Bill left us with that I want to just pick up on that I think is very relevant to the Green New Deal and why it's been so difficult to get progress on climate is the reason why these guys, even though their internal memos and documents said that climate change was a threat and that they needed to change their business model, continued to burn and pollute, is because it would hurt their bottom line. And if you fast forward 30 years or 40 years to right now, the most important thing that we have to do, and that I recommend everybody does with your congressperson or whoever is in power where you are, is understanding and following the money. There is no such thing as climate denialism anymore. It is a fundraising and a political strategy that is aimed at gaining and maintaining power. So I just want to say that. And I think that switching to something more fun, the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal, the way that I conceive of it is essentially a solution to the climate crisis that meets the scale of the crisis without leaving anyone behind. And for a long time, we were sort of nibbling around the edges of the problem. We were, putting a little tax here, a little incentive here. And the truth was the climate crisis, as David Wallace Wells and many others have detailed beautifully and terrifyingly, is an extremely complicated issue that is of massive proportions. And the only thing that can solve it is essentially a decades-long national mobilization, economically, socially, that is a national project that we all get behind. So that is what I conceive of when I think of the Green New Deal. We're not talking about a single bill or a piece of legislature, but we're talking about dozens of pieces of policy at the federal level and at all levels of government. This is a socioeconomic project for the 21st century.
And by the way, also a very significant job creation project.
Exactly. Yeah? Exactly, Bert. And it's the aim of it is to move our country towards 100% clean energy, to ensure that we are producing clean electricity, clean vehicles and transportation, a clean power sector, ensuring that we are creating millions and millions of high-wage jobs that have the opportunity to engage in a union. We're talking about investing in clean infrastructure, in ensuring that we're guaranteeing the universal right to clean air and clean water. So I think it's inspired by the New Deal. Maybe some of you have been looking at that recently, especially as it's relevant in these times. But that was a period of time when people perceived an existential threat in the Great Depression and came together around the opportunity of the New Deal. We saw an unbelievable level of policymaking, and I think that is possible today as well. So when we see the corona, yeah, go ahead, Senator.
No, I just wanted to wrap it up, and then I want to go to Jay.
Great. Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Jay, what are you seeing? I mean, you interact with governors all over the country, with mayors all over the country. We have a president who not only doesn't recognize the reality of climate change, he is moving in exactly the wrong direction, making us more dependent on fossil fuel. Tell us some of the good things on the ground that are taking place around this country in cities and towns and states, if you could.
Well, look, Trump, as I've said, has not been able to stop local leadership who has understood that their communities can benefit both in health and economically by moving, boldly on this. We've done it in Washington State because we understand science and we understand technology and we understand how to create jobs. But that's happening in so many different places. New Mexico, Michelle Lujan Grisham, who's done super work on wind power. Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, who's doing super work in good transportation issues. Janet Mills in Maine. Gavin Newsom is carrying on the tradition of Jerry Brown. There are so many states that are making such substantial progress, and we don't hear about that, frankly, because our media is sort of focused in Washington D.C. Those senators are pesky. Those senators get all the glory. But I think there's so much better news out there than we hear sort of from the national media in that regard. But again, it depends, and this is kind of a refrain I'm going to have. It depends on we, the people, being able to elect a few more legislators and a few more governors to get this job done. And Bernie and I enjoyed the megaphone of a presidential race, but everybody on this call has the ability to do something locally that is just as important. Look, if you can get a legislator elected in your community this November that can turn the tide, that maybe gets your state to pass a clean fuel standard, to mandate cleaner fuels, that is everybody is important and noble a pursuit as a presidential race. And so I know it's possible. We're moving the needle big time in our state. And let me just riff on what Varshney was saying about the Green New Deal. Just one little story. I was overlooking at the forest fire damage in eastern Washington a couple of years ago. And the forest fire had burned right up to where a new wind farm was, these wind turbines, about a dozen wind turbines here in Ellensburg, Washington. And Trudy and I were just standing there, and I was taking pictures of the wind turbine, and this nice white pickup came driving down the road, and a young man got up, and we started talking for a minute, and I was talking about wind and climate change. And he goes, you know what climate change means to me, Congressman? I said, no, what does it mean? He says, it means this new pickup. And he slapped this new pickup. He says, I can now afford the best pickup I've ever had because I'm making, I don't know, 80, 90 or whatever, maintaining these wind turbines. This is a meat and potatoes, jobs for everybody. And we just got to get people to talk about those jobs. They're real. Bill has written so many great books on this subject, but this is an issue of being able to afford, your mortgage. And that's how we got to talk to people about this. And I believe we're going to win a lot of races doing that, including the White House.
And the thing is, just to jump in for a minute, that is also very true at the international level. It used to be the case that looking around the world, we really worried because it seemed as though if we wanted to secure a habitable future for the planet as a whole, it would mean asking nations in the developing world to grow more slowly in order to grow responsibly. But that calculus really has shifted just in the last few years, in part because of the incredibly rapid decline in the price of renewable energy, such that you see a government like Indonesia, which has doubled its per capita income and halved its poverty rate over the last 20 years, but done so by industrializing, by doubling its emissions. They say that they can cut their emissions in half now by 2030 and still grow faster than they've grown over the last 2 decades when they doubled their income. So it's not just a matter of how people can benefit in states like Washington or in countries like the U.S. The truth is this is a new landscape that faces everyone around the world, which is critical because, as you suggested, Senator, this is a global problem. And just to say one last point about the geopolitics, I do think it's a critically important feature of the Trump presidency on climate that he has not just evacuated American leadership, but he's also antagonized Xi Jinping in China, who are likely the critical partners in any major project that we have to really take care of this. And that relationship was going to be dicey anyway. That is not, they're not our natural allies, but we need to work together in the same way that we worked together with the Soviet Union to address nuclear proliferation. We need to do that with China on climate, and Trump has made that much, much harder, even especially during the corona crisis.
Let me ask Varshney or Bill or anybody else, what are we seeing at the grassroots level internationally? Are we seeing folks in Russia, China, Latin America, Africa beginning to stand up Europe? What are we seeing in terms of grassroots effort to try to get their governments to move in an aggressive way towards sustainable energy and energy efficiency?
Well, I can talk from the perspective, at 350.org, we organize in pretty much every country in the world. And so there is a powerful movement everywhere around the world. Almost everywhere it runs into the same problem we do in the US, the power of the fossil fuel industry to try and keep it at bay. So that's the same fight that's going on in Australia, or the same fight that's going on in parts of Asia or much of Europe. But we're making huge progress because, for a good reason, organizing, and for a bad reason, Mother Nature is such a powerful educator that people are just beginning to understand that they have no choice. One of the things that's very striking is, and this follows on something David was saying, is that there are cities where fossil fuel produces so much pollution and people's lives are so affected by it that for that reason too, there's big change coming. Look, we're very rightly concerned about the lung damage that comes from coronavirus. But let's talk about lung damage for a minute. There are 5 million children in New Delhi. We think 2.5 million of them have irreversible lung damage just from breathing the air. Okay, so that gives you some sense of what the stakes are in this fight, and that's why there are people. All I mean, all you know, every morning I'm on the phone with our crew in the South Pacific or in Eastern Europe or in all the places where people are making this fight, and it's really inspiring to watch. They don't call it global warming for nothing. And in a world, as David said, that's been allowed to kind of spin apart, this is the place where we can come back together in an effort to really make change happen and make change happen on behalf of everyone, but on behalf, I mean, remember the iron law of climate change here and around the world. The less you did to cause it, the quicker and the harder it hits you. So when we talk about justice, when we talk about inequality, one of the things we're talking about is climate change and the way it's rewriting just the most basic physical foundations of our societies.
Varshney, let me ask you, is the Sunrise Movement working? I think I know the answer. Working with young people around the world?
So we primarily focused domestically, in large part because, you know, we had a series of experiences at international climate agreement meetings where we were witnesses to the level of obstructionism that the US is creating around the world. And so we said, you know what, the best way we can be in solidarity with places like Fiji and island nations is to come correct at home. So we focused really actively domestically, but we are in partnership. The youth strike movement is unbelievable. Just last fall in September, over 7 million young people striked in virtually every continent in the country and in the world, and it was tremendous. So we're allied with a lot of organizations in Canada and the UK and Australia and other places as part of that global strike movement.
Okay. All right, I'll tell you what, let's go if we could. We've got a number of questions here, far more than we are going to be able to address. All right, let me start off with a question from Amy Lafont, and she asks, how much time would it take to modernize
that? We are going to clean up the air that we breathe. We're going to create thousands of new jobs, and we're going to reduce our carbon emissions. And we want to have carbon free by 2045. That is now law of the state of Washington. I point out those two dates because they both are very realistic. They're very achievable, even using existing technology. Now, we know the technology is going to get better. We know that the price of solar is going to continue to go down. But even using existing technology, these are very capable. We're very capable of achieving these ends. So we wouldn't take that jump if we didn't think it was very achievable, and we believe that it is in the state of Washington. But it takes legislation because, as Bill has talked about, this game is so rigged against clean air because we still have this giant subsidy going to the coal and oil-based generation of electricity. And until we remove those subsidies, the best measure is an absolute mandate that our utilities give us clean energy and get off of fossil fuels. So we have done that, and we have done that with a high degree of confidence. And what gives us confidence on this is that the rate of reduction of cost has been so dramatic. The price of installed solar has come down 80% just in the last few years. And there's no reason why, the curve may flatten a little bit, but there's no reason to believe that that is not going to continue in the right direction. So you bet this can be done.
Let me pick up on that, Jay, with another question. And that question is, how much money would it take for all Americans to have low-cost renewable energy as a primary source? And let me go beyond that. You know and I know that, depending on where you live, if you put solar panels on your house, it requires an initial down payment, but the payback, depending on where you live, is 7, 8, 9 years. And then maybe for the next 10 or 15 years, you literally have free electricity. So that is a good investment. But the impediment right now is that a lot of working class and lower income families cannot afford the initial down payment. So they end up paying more for electricity than somebody who can invest in solar. Now, if you had a sane government that wanted to protect working families and lower their electric bills, not to mention cut carbon emissions, we would be investing heavily in solar. But Bill, tell me, give me some ideas now. If we want to have millions and millions of homes throughout this country have solar, what does it take to do?
So Bernie, you've gotten to see this firsthand. You've gone down Route 7 and seen those homes, say in Rutland, where they, low income homes where they not only put some solar up, they did the other work that we have to do, which is things like insulate the hell out of homes, go to air source heat pumps instead of oil or gas burner in the basement, that kind of stuff. All that stuff, as you point out, pays back. It pays back beginning month one, because your bill, you're no longer paying an oil bill or a gas bill. The only problem is figuring out the financing, and that's what governments are there for, to allow us to make smart investments that pay off quickly over time. And
well, so just picking up on that, I can remember like it was yesterday, but it was like 20 years ago. We got some money. We got a lot of money in the state of Vermont for sustainable energy, for energy efficiency. Went to a house that two older women in Barrie, Vermont, central Vermont, were living. We retrofitted their old home. Their electric bill went down by 50%. Point being, if we help people make their homes energy efficient, we provide solar, people will save money on their electric bills. If you don't believe in climate change, you don't care about the environment, fine. We will save you substantial sums of money through sustainable energy.
Vermont's, you know that that's true because when you drive around Vermont in the winter, you watch, and it's the poorest houses in the state are the ones where there's heat rippling out from every wall, where people are essentially paying to heat the outdoors, and it's disgusting for them to have to pay that money, people who could put that money to good use. And instead, they're handing it over to the utilities and to the oil companies. And it really is time to end that, even if there wasn't a climate crisis that threatened the planet. It's ridiculous to have people having to pay money for something that doesn't do any good.
Right. All right. Let me go to a question. I'm mispronouncing a name, no doubt. Kaina M. Ciccone. And she writes, are there ways to start change very locally? All right, what can people do at the local level? They're not in the Senate, they're not in the Congress, they're not a governor. What can they do locally? Varshini, you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would say first and foremost, you should join a movement, join an organization. One of the best ways to get involved right now is to join. It could be Sunrise, it could be 350.org, it could be whatever climate organization is around you. And see, the way that we have structured our movement is that any person anywhere can be a part of our organization, can start a chapter, can participate in our activities, whether that means electing a congressperson that's a Green New Deal champion, whether it means pushing for state-based legislation, whether it means working on the presidential campaign so we can stop Donald Trump. This is an opportunity for us to make a national movement local and have these local victories and chapters across the country feeding into a national movement.
Let me throw out another idea which has not come up, but I think we've had some real success, and that is the issue of divestment.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Who wants to say a word on
Close
the
to my heart.
of divestment and some of the victories that have been won there?
I want to boast on Varshini for a minute. Varshini got the University of Massachusetts to divest from fossil fuel. This has become the largest anti-corporate campaign in history, As of today, we're at $14 trillion worth of endowments and portfolios that have divested from fossil fuel. The University of California system divested last year. Oxford University, the most prestigious university in the world, divested 2 weeks ago. They've been joined by, the New York City Pension Fund, all the public accounts of the country of Ireland. You could list this for all day and all night. And the result has been that we've seen the financial community's understanding of the fossil fuel industry change dramatically. These guys no longer want to keep pouring money into this industry because they know it's on the way out. You ever see that guy, Jim Cramer, who comes on CNBC and yells at you about which stock to pick and stuff? Well, he said this winter, there's no money to be made in fossil fuels anymore because the divestment movement has taken too many funds out of this game. People won't invest in it. So get the hell out of big oil. There's no money there. And he's right. This has been the worst performing part of the economy. That's why they have no option now but to turn to Congress to try and give them money, because Wall Street's gotten kind of sick of it. They're sick of losing money on them. The only people really who want to keep losing money on these guys are the Republican Party. And unfortunately, at the moment, they're in the position to fork over hundreds of billions of dollars. That's one of the reasons we've got to keep that from happening anymore.
All right, one of the areas, David mentioned it early on, but we haven't spent much time on it. It is enormously important, and that's agriculture. What David said earlier, and I think everybody agrees, in the Midwest, throughout the world, farmers are going to see diminished crops as the climate warms, as they deal with drought, as they deal with floods, and that's a real threat to the production of food throughout the world. And Marilyn Chiarello writes, the climate change crisis presents an opportunity to transform our food system. How can we shift from factory farming to local regenerative farming food systems? Who wants to take a shot at that? Local agriculture.
I guess I'll start. The risks to agriculture are enormous, and they're among the scariest threats that come our way. It's estimated that by the end of the century, if we don't change course, we could be dealing with grain yields that are only half as bountiful as they are today. We'd be using them to try and feed maybe 50% more people on the planet. And there's been a lot of research recently showing that climate change will also raise the risk of what's called multiple breadbasket failure. So it won't just be the American Midwest or the Mediterranean or the breadbaskets of China that are failing. It'll be all three of them at once, which will push an incredible pressure on the diet needs of the planet. We already know many people in the present day are suffering from inadequate food. But we also know that we have a lot of solutions here. Regenerative agriculture is a really powerful tool, not just in making crops grow better and more bountifully, but also actually because it allows us to store carbon much more efficiently. We know that by using traditional pasturing practices, we can turn cattle farms, which have been thought of as a carbon problem, into what are called carbon sinks that absorb carbon. It's also true that we may have some technological innovations that will allow us to produce more food through the engineering of crops. But to this point, scientists have tried that for decades. And because most of the scientists doing that work are working at the same companies that are producing pesticides, mostly they've invested their time in making their crops more resistant to pesticides, not more resilient in the face of heat or drought or famine. So we need to do a lot more R&D at the tech level, but we also have to embrace, through policy and through consumption choices, we need to embrace more traditional modes of agriculture wherever we can, especially in places like the U.S. That is, for all of its deep problems, poised to do that already culturally, I think.
Anybody want to say a word?
I want to add something that David alluded to, and that is that we have a vision where agriculture can be a service provider of sequestering carbon dioxide in the soil and in our tree fiber. And in our carbon pricing systems, which will level the playing field so we won't be having such a subsidy to the fossil fuel industry, the elegant solution is to have essentially those funds used to essentially pay the farmer or the tree crop grower to sequester carbon in the soil and in the trees so they get out of the atmosphere. That gives a stream of revenue to the agricultural industry that can really inspire them not only to keep healthy financially, but to get carbon out of the atmosphere. We think this has real promise. We started this action. It also, frankly, is it's good politics too, because it gets the agricultural industry to understand there's a dual benefit for dealing with climate change. Not only can you prevent climate from destroying the system upon which our whole ag system is dependent on, but you actually get a stream of revenue. So now you've got a new way. You rent your acre for a wind turbine, you get paid there. Then you get paid from the pricing system that pays you to do the cropping systems that keeps carbon in your soil. I think this has great promise.
All right, let me wrap it up. Just ask each of you to make a very, very brief closing statement. Maybe start off within the narrative why I am optimistic that, in fact, we can take on the fossil fuel industry, that we can transform our energy system, and we can save the planet for our kids and our grandchildren. David?
Well, I always like to say that optimism is a matter of perspective. So while it's hopeless, I think, to try to preserve the planet's climate as we've known it, all of the signs are pointing in the right direction. Political movement, public opinion, even business interests are moving in the right direction. They're not nearly where we want them to be, but they're showing much more concern and fear than they did a few years ago. We need that to accelerate. And one of the great gifts of movements like Sunrise is that it shows us that things that once were considered impossible to put into practice, within a few years' time can become conventional wisdom. And we need even more of that going forward. I think we're moving in the right direction. The question is whether we can accelerate things at the speed that we really need them to go.
Good. Bill?
That's right. It's a question of pace. A year ago, a bunch of us in different groups put together this thing called Stop the Money Pipeline to try and pressure the pillars of global capital, the big banks, the insurance companies, the asset managers. In a year, that landscape has changed a lot. The CEO of BlackRock, which is the biggest box of money on planet Earth, said in January that they were going to have to take climate change into account when they made every decision going forward. If they live up to that in any significant way, then we're going to see unrelenting pressure. Now, the question is always, can we make it happen fast enough? So I started by saying physical reality matters. Let's remember what the scientists have told us. We have, according to the IPCC, until 2030 to make fundamental transformations in our energy system, which they described as cutting emissions in half, if we want to have any hope of the kind of future that David described, a future where we're able to limit the temperature increase to the targets we set in Paris. That's a decade. That means we have to do everything we can for this decade, because it's the last time we're going to have that kind of leverage. And that's why it's incredibly powerful to see people like Varshini and her crew rising up. We need, the only thing I'm going to say about the power of young people, about the 10,000 Greta Thunbergs there are around the world who are leading this fight, about Sunrise Movement. The only thing I'm going to say about that is, it's not okay to take the biggest problem that the planet ever faced and offload it onto the shoulders of high school sophomores, okay? So it's very good that they're leading us, but it's time for everybody else to stand the hell up and get working on this. I know we're in the middle of a pandemic, and one of the things that pandemic has shown is that, yeah, there's some knuckleheads out there, but mostly people can come together and work together and make big changes when they have to. We're going to need that kind of affection for each other going forward, because it's going to be a really, really dynamic and important decade ahead.
Thanks, Bill. Varshini?
Wow. Thank you so much for all the kind words and for the call to action. Yes, we cannot save you, but we do want you to join our movement. Look, there is absolutely no way to feel hopeless when your phone banking captain in Kentucky is a 14-year-old. There is no way to feel hopeless when the person running your call technology for electoral efforts is 12. There is no way to feel hopeless when your volunteer leaders are jumping into action in Birmingham in the midst of Corona to take care of their communities, in Birmingham, Alabama, to take care of their communities and modeling action that now politicians are following. So there is no way to feel hopelessness when you have community and solidarity and you have a plan and you're taking action. So I just want to say, if you are feeling hopeless or isolated or upset that Bernie had to drop out or scared, join the movement and go to sunrisemovement.org. It's very easy. And we want you to be a part of this movement because we need each other. We need every person that we can get in these trenches. And thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you very much. Jay?
Two things. One, there's so many good things happening in clean energy. There's a lot to celebrate. I co-authored a book in 2012 that basically predicted that we were going to have clean energy things at scale and at cost that work. And about 85% of that book has come true. We got electric cars, we got solar panels, we got wind, we got efficiency. We've got it all coming very, very quickly. So there's so much to celebrate technologically. But second, as to why be positive, Bernie, you're an old basketball player. I remember playing with you in the congressional days. You were really tough. And what we know in a basketball game is, look, if you're going to win, you don't win thinking you're going to lose, right? It makes it more likely you're going to win if you believe you're going to win. So I believe we're going to win this very deeply, and it's going to help us. And thanks a lot, Bernie, and thanks for being with this great group.
All right. Well, I am optimistic because we have great leaders and writers like the ones that we have seen this evening. And I am optimistic because I believe that deep down, people throughout our country, people throughout the world understand and increasingly understand that it is imperative that we act boldly, that we have the courage to take on the greed and corruption of the fossil fuel industry. Because you know what? We want to make sure that our kids and our grandchildren have a planet that is healthy and is habitable. And I think we're seeing that movement throughout our own country, led by the young people in many respects, but also throughout the world. So let me thank all of you for watching our virtual town meeting tonight. And let me thank our panelists for being with us and for the great work that they are all doing. Everybody stay healthy, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you. Good night.